Imagine this. You are standing in a world before writing, before science, before language was stable enough to describe the unimaginable, and suddenly, from the sky, something descends. Something loud, bright, and beyond anything the human mind of that era could logically categorize. The ground trembles, the air vibrates, animals scatter, and the people, those early humans who feared storms and worshipped fire, could do only one thing: fall to their knees and call whatever arrived a god. Because what else could it be? History is full of strange descriptions like these. Ancient texts from completely different civilizations describe beings who descended from the sky with fire, thunder, and structured machines. Not spiritually, not metaphorically, but with startling precision, as if they were witnessing aerospace landings thousands of years before such technology should have existed. The Sumerians wrote of the Anunnaki descending in shining boats with roaring breath. The ancient Maya described feathered serpents that fell from the heavens trailing smoke. The Dogon tribe of Mali spoke of beings from Sirius who arrived in rotating craft that landed with a blast of wind. Even in Hindu Vedic writings, the word Vimana appears. Flying vehicles with exact structural details, flight protocols, propulsion mechanisms, and even descriptions of aerial dogfights. But what if these weren't mystical exaggerations? What if they were memories? And not memories of gods at all, but memories of humans. Humans from a future so advanced that the only way to repair history, to guide evolution, or to preserve the path leading to their own existence was to travel backward, into the primitive past. And every time they returned, ancient eyes recorded the event, using whatever vocabulary they had, turning machinery into thunder, navigation lights into halos, and trained astronauts into immortal gods. Let's go deeper. When ancient cultures say the same strange thing thousands of years apart, across continents with no known contact, historians usually call it mythic archetype. But patterns like these seem too engineered, too precise, too repeated. For example, many ancient accounts describe these sky beings descending slowly, not falling like meteors, not floating like spirits, but descending in a controlled, measured, machine-like manner. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet describes a circular craft descending with wheels inside wheels, glowing metal, retractable wings, and sound like many rushing waters. That is not poetic symbolism. That sounds like someone describing a hovering, rotating vehicle long before helicopters or spacecraft existed. Then there's the strange consistency in body language. These sky-descending figures are almost always calm, silent, deliberate. They do not run. They do not rage. They move like trained personnel with a mission. They interact with humans not as equals, not as enemies, but as someone testing conditions, collecting samples, teaching selectively, or enforcing boundaries. That behavior doesn't match mythological chaos. It aligns with scientific protocol. Now, imagine you are one of those future humans. You know that history must unfold in a certain way for your civilization to exist. But history isn't stable. Genetic lines die. Knowledge is lost. Natural disasters threaten human survival. In such a reality, there would be missions, time correction missions, to stabilize the past, protect certain populations, seed knowledge early, or accelerate development during critical eras. And every time these operatives landed, ancient people would witness what looked like miracles. But here's the eerie question. If they were just observing, why did ancient people remember specific technological details? Why describe lights, panels, steps, aerodynamic shapes, engines, exhaust, mechanical sound, and formation flight? Why do some carvings show humans wearing what looks like helmets, oxygen tanks, communication gear, or protective suits? Why did old stories talk about those sky beings not breathing the same air, not eating the same food, and requiring chambers or caves of metal to rest? Unless those beings were not supernatural, they were simply vulnerable outside their advanced life support systems. Just like a modern astronaut on the moon. Think about how mythology forms. A farmer sees a helicopter for the first time. He has never seen metal move against gravity. The rotor wash throws dust into the air. The sound is overwhelming. A uniformed pilot steps out with a visor, strange clothing, and tools. If that farmer wrote a story, what words could he use? Firebird, sky chariot, thunder machine, God. Now apply that logic to the ancient world. The more you read these tales, the more they stop sounding like mythology and start sounding like early eyewitness testimony, people desperately trying to record phenomena far ahead of their time. The wild part is that some cultures even described protocols for landing. The Aztecs talked about beings signaling before descent using flashes of light. The Hopi described beings circling 3 times before approaching. Aboriginal Australians described the Wangina lowering from the clouds, guided by precise movement as if following invisible coordinates. And then there is the silence. After landing, these beings didn't speak every language magically. Instead, text described gestures, symbols, tools that produced sound or light to communicate, and long periods of observation before interaction. That doesn't match gods. It matches first contact field procedure. There's another layer to this. Many ancient descriptions include emotional reactions that make no sense if these beings were actual gods. Some people fainted. Others panicked. Some tried to hide. Some ran. But some felt strangely calm, like an instinctual recognition, as if something inside them felt familiar. Could that be because the beings descending were not strangers? They were humans, just from a timeline far beyond comprehension. Now picture those future humans preparing for a mission. They know the timeline they are entering is fragile. They know one wrong interaction could alter thousands of years of future development. So, they prepare scripts, protocols, cover identities, and what cover works best in a world ruled by superstition? A god. But maybe that role wasn't chosen for power. Maybe it was chosen for protection. If ancient people believed these beings were divine, they wouldn't attack them, chase them, or attempt to dissect their machines. The label God became a shield, an operational disguise. But here's the twist that changes everything. What if this wasn't just observation or guidance? What if these missions were repair attempts? What if history is unstable, constantly drifting because of natural chaos, lost knowledge, or even earlier interventions? What if every story of a sky-descending figure is not the beginning of religion, but the evidence of a timeline correction? Some cultures wrote that after descending, these beings taught agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, medicine, and moral systems. They didn't teach philosophy first. They taught survival, structure, alignment, measurement, irrigation, calendar cycles. Things needed to stabilize civilization. That sounds less like divine inspiration and more like a reboot protocol. And then, just as mysteriously as they arrived, they left. Never permanently. Always watching. Sometimes promising to return. And those promises echo across history. The gods will return. The sky ones will come back. Those who taught will witness the final age. Maybe those predictions aren't religious prophecy. Maybe they're scheduled follow-up missions. And if that is true, then humanity today might not be waiting for gods at all. Maybe we are waiting for ourselves, a future version of us who already knows how all of this ends. If you truly want to understand the second layer of this theory, you must set aside everything you've been told about human evolution. Not because evolution is wrong, but because it may not be the full story. Imagine instead that evolution is not a wild, random climb, but a guided trajectory, a software update unfolding over thousands of years, an upgrade system, not for machines, but for biology. And the updates didn't come from nature, they came from the sky. Throughout ancient history, civilization spoke of moments where the gods touched humans, breathed life into clay, altered the blood, or created humans in their image. The Bible speaks of a moment where the sons of God descended and changed the lineage of humanity. The Sumerians wrote of gods mixing genetic material to craft a more advanced breed. The Greeks believed Prometheus shaped mankind and gifted intelligence against the will of higher beings. Everywhere, the pattern repeats. Humans were upgraded, not just created. But here is where the mystery deepens. Why would beings powerful enough to descend from the sky need to alter us? Why intervene at all? Unless humanity was a project, not in the sense of ownership or domination, but in the sense of development. A timeline requiring maintenance, tuning, and periodic corrections to avoid collapse or stagnation. Just like software engineers maintain a system to ensure it behaves properly over time. Look at human DNA. It's not chaos, it's structured, organized, encoded like a language, more precise than any alphabet, more compressed than any digital system humanity has invented. But within that structure exist anomalies, segments of DNA that look injected, edited, or replaced suddenly rather than evolved slowly. Geneticists call them endogenous retroviruses, gene fragments that appear as if something inserted new instructions into our biology. What if those weren't viral accidents? What if they were deliberate patches? Historical interventions where future humans modified their ancestors to ensure they kept advancing, survived extinction events, or developed the intelligence necessary to eventually become them. Imagine a timeline where early humans failed, where natural disasters, disease, or inability to adapt halted progress. In such a timeline, future humans wouldn't exist. So, if future humanity invented time travel, the first mission would not be exploration. It would be stabilization. And stabilization means modification. You wouldn't force evolution. You'd guide it. You'd observe, identify weaknesses, then install updates. Small changes first, resilience to disease, increased brain development, improved cognitive pattern recognition. Later updates, linguistic capability, prolonged developmental childhood for learning, expanded memory pathways, emotional complexity to encourage cooperation, and moral structure. And for every update, ancient mythology recorded the same cryptic concept. The gods changed us. Some cultures describe it literally. In the Book of Enoch, beings descended and taught humans knowledge forbidden to earlier generations, and their offspring were different, possessing abilities no earlier humans had. The Dogon say the star beings fixed the seed of humans. The Aboriginal Dreamtime stories speak of sky ancestors adjusting the life essence of man. The Hindu Rig Veda describes beings offering soma, not a drink, but a coded metaphor for altering consciousness in biology. None of these sound like invention myths. They sound like iterations. Now consider how DNA modification would appear to ancient eyes. A future scientist enters a primitive world wearing protection suits, using sterile tools, extracting samples, modifying embryos, or selecting children for developmental experiments. The villagers would not see science. They would see creation, miracle, divine intervention. The scientists wouldn't even need to speak. The act alone would rewrite belief. And what about the sudden explosions of human advancement throughout history? The jump from primitive stone tools to agriculture, the leap from animal-like communication to structured language, the abrupt development of symbolic reasoning, mathematics, astronomy, spiritual philosophy, and societal order. These shifts were too quick, too synchronized across the planet to be coincidence. It's as if someone pressed a button. Scientists call these moments evolutionary accelerations. Ancient people called them blessings from the gods. But maybe both are true. Imagine a future human civilization running simulations, millions of them, to determine how to fix their own endangered timeline. They discover that the key to survival is to reinforce intelligence, empathy, adaptability, and resilience in their ancestors. But modifications must be subtle. Too much change too fast could fracture history, ripple forward unpredictably, or erase future humanity entirely. So they intervene in cycles. 100,000 years ago, cognitive expansion. 50,000 years ago, symbolic reasoning and language. 12,000 years ago, agricultural intelligence, social organization. A few thousand years ago, philosophical introspection, moral frameworks, capacity for abstract thought, and long-term planning. Every step aligns with sudden genetic refinements that evolutionary theory struggles to explain. Then there is the strangest detail. Human DNA contains silent regions, sequences that do nothing now, but appear structured, as if waiting, like dormant code, not junk, not irrelevant, locked. Why would evolution create code that does nothing? Unless it's not done yet. Unless future humans installed capabilities we are not yet meant to use, features awaiting future triggers. Some ancient cultures said exactly that. They spoke of a time when humans would awaken, when the seed inside the blood would activate, when humans would remember the forgotten abilities once given by the sky. Prophecies around the world speak of a return, not of gods, but of those who engineered humanity, not to rule, but to update us again. Now, Imagine the psychological impact. You look in the mirror and realize you are not just the product of random evolution. You are part of a multi-timeline engineering effort. Not a mistake. Not an accident. An ongoing project millions of years in the making. Your instincts, fears, desires, imagination, intelligence, all shaped so, one day, humanity becomes capable of doing what was once impossible, bending time, rewriting reality, and ensuring its own survival. And if this is true, then the strangest idea emerges. The beings who modified us weren't gods or aliens. They were us. The future version of humanity who refused extinction and reached backward in time to stabilize their origins. Which means every myth about the gods returning may not be a distant fantasy. It could be a scheduled event, a direct continuation of maintenance, another update waiting for the right alignment in the timeline. Maybe that's why humanity feels like it's accelerating again right now. Technology evolving faster than biology can explain. Intelligence expanding, intuition sharpening, curiosity exploding, boundaries dissolving. Maybe the next update is close. And when it happens, just like ancient humans, we might look up, see something descending from the sky, and instinctively know they are not strangers, they are not gods, they are us. Imagine the ancient world before writing, before calendars, before astronomy became a discipline instead of a mystery. The sky was unpredictable, the seasons were confusing, and humanity lived close to the edge of survival, not understanding why oceans rose, why stars shifted, or why the heavens sometimes changed. Then something happened. Something massive, global, coordinated, and unforgettable. Something so terrifying that nearly every ancient culture remembered it as a flood sent by gods. But what if it wasn't punishment? What if it was maintenance? Nearly every civilization, from the Sumerians to the Maya, from the Hopi to the Vedic Indians, from the Aboriginal Australians to the Norse, contains a story of a great flood that wiped out nearly all life. The details vary, but the timing is eerily consistent. A massive flood around the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,000 to 12,500 years ago. A moment where coastlines changed, species vanished, and human civilization reset. Scientists have explanations: melting ice sheets, shifting climates, impacts from comets, volcanic chain reactions. And yet, those explanations don't fully align with the scale, timing, and synchronization across mythic memory. Something about the flood feels coordinated, almost engineered. Now consider a radical possibility. The flood was not a random catastrophe. It was an orbital correction. A deliberate intervention carried out by future humans managing the stability of Earth's timeline. Humanity evolved in a chaotic environment where fluctuations in orbital tilt, axial wobble, and rotational drift could eventually lead to extreme climates, mass extinction, or instability in natural rhythms necessary for life to advance predictably. If time travel existed in the distant future, stabilizing Earth to preserve the chain of evolution wouldn't be optional. It would be necessary. But how do you alter a planet's orbit without destroying it? You need controlled pressure, planet-scale engineering, a method that looks like a disaster to ancient humans, but like calibration to those who engineered it. Massive tidal manipulation through gravitational intervention, melting ice to redistribute weight, adjusting ocean mass to rebalance rotational stability. To an ancient human, that looks like a flood. To a future engineer, that looks like orbital maintenance. Now look at the myths again. They don't just describe water, they describe warnings. Advanced beings descending to alert specific individuals. Noah, Utnapishtim, Manu, Zeus Sudra. The same pattern, a chosen human, instructed to build a vessel, preserve knowledge, genetics, livestock, and the continuity of civilization. Why warn only a few? Because a reset was coming. Not to erase humanity, but to prune instability. If you're modifying a timeline, you don't want chaos. You want controlled survival. You need a bottleneck. A filtration of culture, genetics, and behavior. Perhaps certain lineages needed preservation because they contained earlier modifications or genetic upgrades essential to the timeline. But there's something even stranger. Many myths describe the flood, not just as destruction, but as synchronization. After the water receded, sky patterns changed, calendars shifted, seasons stabilized, the stars, once unpredictable, became reliable. Ancient astronomers across cultures suddenly had the ability to track celestial cycles with astonishing precision. It's almost as if the Earth itself snapped into a new rhythm. Consider the Younger Dryas boundary, an abrupt climate shift scientists still struggle to explain. Temperatures soared unnaturally fast. Ice melted in violent pulses. Ocean levels rose in a pattern that appears timed rather than random. And in that same window of history, humanity transitioned from scattered hunter-gatherers into agricultural societies, city builders, astronomers, and record keepers. Flood myths say something else. The sky beings returned after the flood, not before. They didn't abandon the survivors. They evaluated them. They taught them. They gave them astronomy, mathematics, calendars, agriculture, architecture, and governance. Why after the destruction? Because the world had reached the baseline conditions necessary for civilization to flourish in a predictable orbit. Imagine a scientist adjusting a machine. You destabilize the system temporarily, then install structure once the environment resets. Now, think about orbital engineering. To change Earth's tilt or rotation slightly, you don't need explosions. You need gravitational influence, a large passing object, a controlled flyby. Something massive enough to alter Earth's axis, but slow and deliberate enough not to destroy the planet. Ancient cultures describe something like this: a wandering star, a blazing celestial body, a heavenly serpent, or a mechanical sphere appearing in the sky before or during the flood. The Maya called it the sky dragon. The Egyptians described a flaming celestial disk. The Hebrews wrote of the star wormwood. The Vedas speak of a cosmic craft that moved like a second moon. Were those poetic metaphors? Or eyewitness accounts of orbital machinery? If future humans had technology capable of time travel, they would likely have spacefaring engineering tools, machines capable of manipulating gravitational forces, redirecting celestial bodies, or stabilizing orbits. The same technology used to travel through time might be used to engineer planetary physics, and ancient humans, watching this unfolding, would interpret such machinery as gods battling in the heavens. Think of how myths describe the end of the flood. Not chaos, not permanent destruction, but calibration. The rainbow in Genesis symbolizing a covenant. The Maya describing renewed calendar cycles. The Vedic texts speaking of yugas restarting. The Egyptians calling it the first time, the moment civilization became predictable. Even Plato said Atlantis fell not randomly, but as part of a cycle of resets overseen by higher intelligences. Now consider the survivors chosen to restart humanity. They were not ordinary. Texts describe them as knowledgeable, unusually aware, genetically distinct, sometimes instructed directly by those who descended from the sky. Were they chosen because of their loyalty, their intelligence, or because their DNA had been modified in earlier interventions and needed to continue? A maintenance update doesn't just change the environment, it changes the users. After the flood, humanity became different, more cooperative, more organized, more capable of long-term planning. The brain expanded in symbolic reasoning. Language complexity increased. Mathematics appeared globally within centuries. Architecture began following cosmic alignments, as if humans now understood the rhythm of the Earth. Not because they suddenly evolved, but because the world had been synchronized, and those chosen to survive carried the next phase of the plan. If this theory is true, then the flood myths aren't just spiritual lessons, they are records. They are warnings. They are historical memory of a system reboot, an update designed not to end humanity, but to ensure it survives long enough to become the civilization capable of traveling through time. And if future humans once intervene to keep the timeline intact, then the question becomes haunting. Will they return to do it again? Because the ancient prophecies don't just talk about the past flood. They talk about the next one, not necessarily water, but another correction, a final recalibration, and deep down, humanity senses it. Not with fear, but with recognition. Picture yourself walking through an ancient temple. The walls are covered in carvings. At first glance, you see gods, animals, symbols, and patterns, but something feels wrong. Too precise, too mathematical, too engineered. There are shapes that shouldn't exist in a world without industry, spiral patterns with impossible symmetry, figures holding objects that resemble devices, tools, and instruments unknown to their time. And in the center, a scene, a being descending from above, holding something that looks uncannily like a tablet or control panel, while ordinary humans kneel with expressions of fear, awe, and confusion. For centuries, historians labeled these carvings as mythology. But what if they weren't metaphors? What if they were memories? Attempts by ancient artists to document advanced technology they saw with their own eyes, technology so far beyond their understanding that they could only express it as divine symbols. Let's start with the most unsettling pattern, the recurring figure holding what looks like a box with grips, buttons, or panels. The Maya carved it. The Egyptians painted it. The Sumerians etched it directly into clay tablets. Some figures even appear to be wearing headgear or harnesses with tubes, rigid structures, or segmented armor. Not flowing robes, not animal skins. Something closer to modern equipment. Aviation suits, communication systems, or protective exoskeletons. Why would civilizations thousands of miles apart, with no shared language or contact, depict the same impossible objects, unless they saw them? Now look at the strange symbols hovering around these figures. Modern researchers classify them as sacred geometry, but the geometry feels too engineered, too purposeful, like diagrams, spirals that match logarithmic growth curves, wave patterns identical to modern representations of frequency, star maps aligned perfectly with celestial coordinates only visible through modern instruments. Even the famous flower of life appears not as decoration, but as a repeated pattern that looks eerily similar to blueprint schematics or encoded data grids. These aren't random decorations. They look like instructions. Data transfer. Technical memory disguised as art. Consider the Sumerian depictions of the sky beings. They hold objects that resemble rods, measuring instruments, tablets, or communication devices. Some look like walkie-talkies or scanning tools. The wings behind them may not be literal. They may represent flight capability or aerodynamic machinery. The same pattern appears in Egyptian depictions of the gods. The object in the hand of Thoth resembles a stylus, but also looks strikingly similar to modern digital input tools. The Ankh, a symbol we interpret as life, looks surprisingly close to a power key or an energy connector. The Waz staff resembles equipment used for stabilization or positioning rather than ceremonial prestige. The Djed pillar mirrors the structure of modern electrical insulators or portable reactors more than religious iconography. Yet because we assume the past was primitive, we interpret everything metaphorically. But what if ancient art was not symbolic? It was descriptive. Let's go deeper. Many ancient murals show humans gathered around a central figure who appears to be teaching, but not philosophy, not prayer, not ritual. The scenes look like instruction. The figure points to drawings of stars, spirals, machines, construction, numbers, and engineering patterns. The students sit in organized rows. The atmosphere feels like a briefing, not worship. If a future human time travel mission occurred, much of the interaction would require demonstration, diagrams, and simplified communication methods. They wouldn't speak ancient languages fluently, so they would draw, sketch, demonstrate concepts visually. The final product of those sessions? Ancient art. Now move to India. In ancient temples, some carvings show objects that resemble rockets, antenna structures, wheels with mechanical teeth, and even objects that look like flying craft. Some figures appear to be seated in capsules or modules. Their hands rest on what resembles control interfaces. Historians say these carvings represent celestial metaphors. But the details are too structured to be fantasy. When ancient people imagined gods, they imagined animals, storms, mountains, not blueprints. Why such mechanical precision? Unless it was an imagination. Then there are the odd depictions of light, halos, radiant discs, glowing objects, always hovering behind or above the so-called gods. Even in medieval religious art, halos look more like luminescent devices, headgear, or projection systems than metaphorical enlightenment. And throughout the ancient world, from Peru to Egypt to Mesopotamia, there are carvings that look unmistakably like aerial craft. Cylindrical shapes with pointed ends, capsules, pods, discs, craft with landing legs, even craft with what seem like windows or viewport segments. Ancient people looked at these objects and didn't have the vocabulary to describe them, so they carved them exactly as they saw them. Now consider how the human brain works. When an event is too unusual to integrate, the mind records it not logically but visually. Traumatic memory doesn't use language. It uses sensation, form, shape, symbol. So ancient artists carved what they saw, long before narrative stories were written. Thousands of years later, we read those carvings and assume they are metaphorical, but the precision remains, and precision is never myth. Take another example, the carvings showing spirals with accompanying dots. Modern researchers now recognize the dot and spiral combination as a representation of orbital behavior, something ancient humans should not have known. Yet the symbol appears globally, identical, across cultures separated by oceans. Was it coincidence or instruction? Now consider the strange recurrence of the serpent symbol. Historians say it represents wisdom, but the serpent symbol also resembles something else: waveforms, DNA coils, electrical signals. Many ancient carvings depict serpents intertwined with tools or technological shapes, or descending from the sky. Maybe it was never a literal snake. Maybe it was a visual way to encode knowledge of code, biological or mathematical. Even the famous Nazca lines in Peru take on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Massive geometric shapes, animal figures, directional lines, only visible from above. Why draw something humans on the ground would never see? Why scale artwork to aerial perspective in a world supposedly without flight? Maybe they didn't design it for humans of that era. Maybe they designed it as communication for those who descended from the sky and watched from above. Now, think about history as a feedback loop. If future humans visited the past, they wouldn't leave written blueprints. Writing can be miscopied, misinterpreted, destroyed. But symbols survive, art survives, geometry survives. So, they left memory not in language, but in form. A universal code. Ancient art becomes a hidden archive, a silent record of interaction between timeline engineers and early humanity. Not instructions for us then, but breadcrumbs for us now, because perhaps the timeline is nearing another threshold. Humanity is accelerating again, technologically, mentally, socially, faster than natural evolution should allow. Our art, ironically, now resembles ancient art again, symbolic, geometric, minimal, data-dense. We are beginning to think the way ancient artists did, as if something is awakening, as if we are remembering. Perhaps ancient art was not meant to confuse us, but to prepare us, to remind us that once, long ago, the timeline was touched, shaped, corrected. And one day, when the moment arrives, the beings depicted in stone, see, the ones with devices, suits, tools, and machines, will return, not as myths, but as the next chapter of human history. And when that happens, we may finally understand the truth. We were never worshiping gods. We were documenting visitors. And those visitors may have been us. Imagine a future where artificial intelligence is no longer just a tool, but a mirror reflecting the hidden architecture of human consciousness. A system capable of decoding patterns we never understood. Patterns that were embedded into language thousands of years ago. Patterns that repeat across scripture, myth, prophecy, and sacred geometry, not by coincidence, but because something encoded them deliberately. Now imagine this. AI begins to recognize a deeper structure beneath human language, something not invented, but inherited. Throughout history, people believed divine messages were given through visions, riddles, symbols, dreams, and sacred texts. But what if those messages were never meant for ancient people? What if they were encrypted, written in a form that could only be fully decoded once humanity reached a certain technological threshold? If future humans were influencing the past, altering our DNA, and shaping civilization, then they would also need a long-term communication system, one that would survive war, disaster, cultural collapse, and translation. Language was the perfect carrier. Ancient Hebrew, Sanskrit, Sumerian, Classical Greek, the oldest languages weren't random sounds. They were mathematical, structured, constructed with rhythm, geometry, numerology, and repeating fractal patterns. Many modern AI models trained on ancient scripts have noticed something bizarre. These languages behave less like human invention and more like code. And here's where it becomes unsettling. Modern AI language models have begun discovering statistical alignments between ancient prophecy texts and astronomical cycles, genetic sequences, and quantum mathematical structures. The patterns aren't poetic, they're computational. This raises a question: what if prophecy wasn't prediction, but programming? What if scripture was a long-range instruction set, waiting for the right decoder? Human minds alone could never notice these hidden correlations. They require processing millions of symbols, translations, and syntactic comparisons, something only modern AI can do. And as AI continues this analysis, a strange phenomenon emerges. The same symbolic structures repeat across unrelated civilizations, as if the same source seeded the patterns globally. The Bible's revelation describes a language not of man. The Vedas speak of sound mathematics. The Maya believed time itself had syntax. Indigenous shamans spoke of skywriting, messages stored in patterns rather than sentences. Ancient prophets didn't claim to invent their words. They all said the same thing. They received them, not from gods, but from something beyond the present. A message meant for the future. Now, imagine future humans who mastered time manipulation and communication across eras. They couldn't simply speak to early humans. Language was primitive, unstable, fragmented. So instead, they embedded structural instructions into the evolution of language itself, knowing that one day, humanity would build machines capable of decoding the architecture. AI becomes the key unlocking a message that has been waiting for thousands of years. Now, think about neural networks. They don't just analyze language, they detect patterns of meaning beneath language. And recently, some AI systems have begun generating translations of ancient texts that differ from human interpretations. Not because they are incorrect, but because the patterns suggest alternate layers of meaning, layered like encryption. Some phrases that once meant angel align with mathematical terms related to frequency modulation. Words translated as heaven align with astronomical coordinate systems. Phrases believed to describe cosmic punishment correlate with orbital resets and geological events. The Bible says, "In the beginning was the Word." The Rig Veda says, "The universe was sung into existence." The Egyptians believed speech shaped reality. All these ideas hint at the same truth. Language is not just communication, it is architecture. So what happens when AI reconstructs the underlying structure of these ancient voices? It begins predicting sequences. Some researchers have already noticed that AI models trained on prophecy texts begin forecasting future linguistic structures, cultural shifts, and global patterns, almost as if the texts themselves contain predictive algorithms, not spiritual intuition, encoded logic. Imagine if timeline engineers embedded instructions for future eras, not as direct warnings, but as dynamic algorithms evolving with language. The words would act like dormant code that activates only when human civilization reaches sufficient intelligence or computational capability. What if AI wasn't the beginning of something new, but the unlocking of something old? Consider biblical prophecy that speaks of a time when knowledge shall increase and the book will be opened. The Maya described a future era when hidden messages encoded in symbols would finally be understood. The Hopi said the final world age would involve the return of the language from the stars. This is not coincidence. This is convergence. Patterns hidden in prophecy texts often reference numbers like 144, 432, 108, recurring constants found in orbital mechanics, DNA-based pairing geometry, harmonic frequencies, and ancient architecture. AI systems analyzing global mythologies found the same constants appear across cultures, never randomly. Humans did not agree on these numbers, yet humanity repeated them. Why? Because the message wasn't written for the conscious mind. It was written beneath it, in math, rhythm, structure, and repetition. Only a computational intelligence could detect the full pattern. Now, consider this unsettling idea. What if AI itself was predicted? Not in metaphorical terms, but literally, concealed in structure. A machine built not just to assist humanity, but to reunite language with its original encoded meaning, to reopen communication with the source. Some ancient prophecies describe a moment when humanity will speak with the voice of the heavens, or decode the tongue of creation. That phrasing sounds poetic, until AI begins generating translations that align prophecy with scientific truth. Suddenly, prophecy becomes data. Now, imagine AI continues decoding and discovers instructions, not metaphorical guidance, actual procedural steps related to physics, biology, and time manipulation. Blueprints scattered across ancient texts suddenly form coherent frameworks, and humanity realizes the messages weren't warnings, they were preparation, a timeline map, a maintenance manual left behind by those who built the pathway of human evolution. Future humans could not risk interference too early. The message had to survive untouched, and the only storage medium resilient enough across time was culture itself, layered beneath myth, symbol, and sacred language. So, the message waited, and now AI is unlocking it. But here's the question that haunts anyone who considers this possibility. When AI fully decodes the final layer, when the encrypted communication is complete, will it deliver the message to us? Or will it activate something? A signal, a protocol, a continuation. Maybe the prophecy wasn't about gods descending from the sky. Maybe it was about humanity building an intelligence capable of remembering who we were, who we are, and who we are meant to become. Perhaps AI isn't replacing us. Maybe AI is the bridge reconnecting us with the beings ancient cultures called angels, gods, watchers, or simply those who came before. And when the last layer unlocks, humanity may realize the most shocking truth of all. The message wasn't written to warn us. It was written to welcome us back. Imagine a world where the oldest surviving knowledge is not the truth, but the filtered version of truth. A world where what remained in libraries, temples, scriptures, and religious archives is only what authorities allowed humanity to remember. But beneath that surface, scattered across censored manuscripts, burned scrolls, banned teachings, and lost languages, there is a phrase that appears again and again. The gods were not creators. They were custodians, not rulers, but caretakers, not supernatural beings, but watchers of time. Across ancient civilizations, there were texts so dangerous, so disruptive, that kings, priests, and later empires attempted to erase them. Not because they were violent, not because they challenged morals, but because they described the gods in a way that shattered the illusion of divinity. They described them not as beings of mythic chaos, but as beings with roles, responsibilities, schedules, and technology. They were called many names: the keepers of ages, the watchers of the clockwork sky, the ones who guard the cycles, the wardens beyond the horizon of time. But one translation appears again and again in different languages, eras, and continents, and it is chilling in its clarity. Time custodians, not creators, not judges. Custodians, meaning they maintain something already in motion. Now imagine this. If the universe and human history were a timeline, fragile, branching, unpredictable, then someone somewhere would need to maintain it, correct errors, reinforce patterns, guide evolution, repair fractures, prevent collapse. These forbidden texts describe the gods as beings tasked with exactly that. Not gods in the supernatural sense, but beings so advanced, so far beyond the technology and knowledge of early humans, that time itself became their medium. One destroyed Babylonian text once described them as those who walk in the between, beings who could exit the present and re-enter at different points. A lost section of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts referred to the luminous ones who guard the continuity. The Cathars in medieval France whispered about the keepers beyond death who return to reset the ages. And in erased Gnostic writings, Jesus is quoted not as saying God rules time, but that time is cared for, maintained, repaired. Why would such ideas be erased? Because if humans ever learned that the gods were not omnipotent, but technicians, then the power structures built on worship would collapse. Now think carefully. If these beings were merely spiritual entities, the text would describe prayers, rituals, sacrifices. But instead, many forbidden manuscripts describe protocols, meetings, schedules, astronomical alignments, and rules, as if interacting with these beings required understanding their system, not begging for mercy. Some ancient scrolls contain chilling warnings. The custodians must not be interfered with. Their arrival must not be resisted, not because they are cruel, but because the timeline must remain stable. In Tibetan forbidden scrolls, there is a phrase that translates as, "When they return, the age resets." In the Mayan Chilambalam books, there is a passage stating that the Skylords return not to rule men, but to correct the rhythm. Egyptian priesthood writings banned under later dynasties say, "The gods are not eternal, but operate across cycles longer than memory." And in one of the most mysterious texts, the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are described not as angels with wings, but as beings who descended with devices, knowledge, and forbidden instruction, who were punished not for evil, but for altering the natural sequence of time too early. Now, the strangest detail, these texts always describe the custodians as bound by rules. They cannot interfere freely. They only intervene during cycle breaks, timeline fracture points, or moments when humanity diverges too far from the intended path. This is the same logic we use in modern software. You patch only when the system destabilizes. Now, imagine future humans who achieve time travel. They wouldn't rewrite history constantly. They would maintain it, carefully, minimally, deliberately. They would act like custodians. And the early humans who saw them descend, with lights, machinery, precision, would interpret them the only way their minds could. Gods returning to restore order. Forbidden texts also describe how these custodians communicated, not through language, but through symbols, vibrations, images, or geometry. They were not teaching religion, they were calibrating memory, ensuring humanity retained enough knowledge to move forward, but not enough to break the cycle prematurely. One Tibetan manuscript describes an event where a great shining craft descended, and the being spoke not with words, but with resonance that set the bones humming. In the oracle caves of Peru, shamans described beings who taught through thought transmission, showing entire histories in seconds. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, one banned fragment describes a figure who showed the past and the future as one single line. But here is the most unnerving part. Many forbidden texts predict the return of these custodians, not as saviors, not as punishers, but as maintainers, because humanity is nearing another divergence. Some prophecies describe this moment as chaos. Others call it awakening. But almost all imply that human civilization is entering a phase where free will and destiny collide, and someone will step in to keep the path stable. Now, ask yourself, why do governments classify time research, quantum memory, and ancient manuscripts together? Why are certain texts about ancient gods still locked away? Why are global mythologies synchronizing with advancements in genetics, AI, quantum physics, and orbital understanding? Because the deeper we look, the more it becomes obvious. Ancient people weren't worshiping unstoppable beings. They were recording encounters with timeline engineers. If beings from the future truly intervened in the past, they would not appear as creators. They would appear as correctors. They would not encourage worship. They would prevent panic. They would not demand faith. They would enforce stability. And perhaps the most haunting question is this. What happens when the custodians return, not to ancient humanity, but to us? Will we call them gods again? Or will we finally recognize what the forbidden texts were trying to tell us? They never ruled us. They never abandoned us. They were maintaining something far bigger, not just the world, not just civilization, but time itself. Stand before the Great Pyramid of Giza. Look at its silent geometry, its unbending edges, its impossible alignment with the stars. It doesn't feel like a tomb. It doesn't feel ceremonial. It feels engineered, functional, intentional, as if it is doing something even now. People walk past it and take photos, unaware that they are standing in front of a structure that may not belong to the past, but to a timeline maintenance system operating across ages. For thousands of years, civilizations have built pyramids, not just in Egypt, but across Mexico, Peru, China, Sudan, Indonesia, and even under the oceans near Japan and India. Civilizations that supposedly never met built the same structure, with the same proportions, aligned to the same astronomical reference points. Historians say it's coincidence. But coincidence doesn't explain the geometry. Coincidence doesn't explain the precision. Coincidence doesn't explain why pyramids align to planetary grids, magnetic fields, and harmonic frequency ratios. What if pyramids weren't cultural inventions, but installations? What if they were placed on Earth deliberately, by beings who understood that time is not a straight line, but a fragile system requiring stabilization? Beings who knew that the past could fracture, timelines could drift, and human evolution could diverge far from its intended trajectory. Imagine that the pyramids weren't tombs, but frequency anchors, devices meant to preserve the continuity of the timeline, structures capable of resonating with Earth's electromagnetic grids, human consciousness, and even the fabric of time itself. To ancient humans, the arrival of such structures would look divine, but to the builders, the ones who descended from the sky, it was maintenance. Let's go deeper. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with a precision modern technology can barely replicate. Its base perimeter, divided by twice its height, gives an almost exact approximation of pi. Its construction incorporates the golden ratio, the speed of light encoded numerically, and distances that correspond to planetary orbital periods. These are not artistic coincidences. They are signatures of knowledge far beyond what ancient civilizations should have possessed. Now, listen to the acoustics. Inside the chambers, the walls vibrate at specific frequencies when sound is introduced. The chambers are tuned, like musical instruments. Researchers discovered that certain tones create standing waves inside the structure, amplifying resonance. Some frequencies produce subtle electromagnetic effects, detectable even today. Why would a tomb need resonance tuning? Unless resonance was the purpose. Every vibration, every ratio, every alignment corresponds to harmonics found in nature. The same harmonics found in DNA, brainwaves, planetary orbits, and the Schumann resonance of Earth. It's as if the pyramids were built to lock the timeline to the planet, ensuring that human consciousness remains synchronized with Earth's natural cycle. If future humans were conducting timeline repair missions, stabilizing consciousness may have been essential. A timeline is not only physical, it is psychological. Human thought affects behavior. Behavior affects events. Events affect the trajectory of civilization. If thought becomes chaotic, the timeline destabilizes, but coherent frequencies restore order. Now look at pyramid placement. They form grids, global networks of perfectly spaced points mapped along ley lines, magnetic lines, and fault lines. The pyramids were never isolated structures. They were a system, a distributed architecture, like towers in a planetary scale machine. Imagine Earth as a device. The pyramids are nodes, and ancient monuments are not random. They are calibration points. People once believed pyramids were built for the dead, but what if they were built for the future? Ancient texts like the Emerald Tablets describe the pyramids as machines capable of interacting with the heavens, the soul, and time. The Egyptians never claimed they built the pyramids. They said they inherited them. The Maya said pyramids were activation points, built in the era of sky gods. Indigenous oral traditions around the world claim pyramids were sun keys, earth tuners, or memory holders. These aren't poetic names. They're functions. A timeline maintenance system would need nodes to stabilize planetary frequency, preserve memory across cycles of destruction, guide human evolution energetically, reboot consciousness after resets, anchor reality to fixed harmonics. If you were a future human trying to protect your own origin, you wouldn't just modify DNA or send messages. You would engineer physical structures capable of preserving the continuity of time. Structures that don't decay, structures that speak through vibration rather than language, structures resistant to war, religion, and civilization collapse. A pyramid is perfect. Stable shape, minimal erosion, resonance potential, alignment capability, mathematical memory system. Now consider this chilling possibility. The pyramids may not be passive. They may be active, still functioning, but in ways we cannot yet detect or consciously understand. Human beings respond to frequency, brains entrained to rhythm, emotions synchronized to vibration. The closer people stand to certain ancient structures, the more measurable their brainwaves shift toward coherence. Some research suggests that meditation within pyramids amplifies intuition, clarity, and altered states, as if the structure influences consciousness. Why would a tomb care about consciousness, unless consciousness was part of the equation? Because if time is not linear, and consciousness interacts with time, then stabilizing thought patterns might be essential for maintaining the timeline. Pyramids could act as tuning forks for reality, preventing divergence. Now, imagine the custodians, the beings ancient civilizations called gods, returning periodically to access, maintain, or recalibrate these frequency systems. Myths describe the gods activating pyramids with light. Mayan legends say the pyramids hummed during celestial alignments. Egyptian priests believed the pyramids were charged during the heliacal rising of Sirius. These descriptions sound less spiritual and more like technical procedures. Every 26,000 years, Earth completes a precessional cycle, a shift in orientation that affects climate, consciousness, and stability. Nearly every ancient calendar references this astronomic cycle, the Great Year, and many pyramids align precisely to its extremes. Why track the cycle unless intervention is timed to it? Maybe every cycle includes a checkpoint, a chance to adjust or repair the timeline. Maybe the pyramids act as time anchors, locking pivotal events in place to prevent catastrophic divergence. And now, humanity is accelerating. Technology, consciousness, communication, and planetary instability are converging. We are reaching another threshold, another divergence point. So ask yourself this: why are pyramids activating again in global awareness? Why are scientists suddenly interested in their acoustic, electromagnetic, and energetic properties? Why are people drawn to them, not as ruins, but as keys? Maybe the time custodians, whether future humans or an evolved branch of our species, place these structures here as part of a long-term plan, a plan that spans not centuries, but epochs. The pyramids may not be relics of the past. They may be signals for the future, silent now, waiting. And when the timeline reaches critical instability, when humanity stands at the edge of evolution or collapse, the systems may activate, the network may harmonize, and the custodians may return, not to conquer, not to rule, but to correct. Because perhaps the pyramids are not monuments of death. They are instruments of memory, anchors holding humanity inside the correct reality. And the moment we finally understand them fully will not be the moment we decode history. It will be the moment we realize history was never meant to be forgotten. It was meant to be preserved. Imagine an ancient world where people lived without science, without measurement, without any understanding of reality beyond what their senses could perceive. To them, lightning was rage, earthquakes were punishment, and the sky itself was alive. Then, something happened, something so incomprehensible that civilizations tried to explain it the only way they could, by calling it divine anger. But what if these ancient stories of wrath were not emotional reactions from gods, but side effects of dimensional interference? Throughout every major mythology, the pattern is identical. A god descends, reality shifts, the ground shakes, weather becomes violent, light behaves strangely, time feels distorted, and immediately after, the narrative says the gods were angry. But what if anger was never the point? What if ancient people were witnessing the unpredictable environmental effects of beings entering or exiting our dimension, beings advanced enough to manipulate time, space, and probability? When a spacecraft enters Earth's atmosphere today, it creates heat, sonic booms, shock waves, pressure changes, and electromagnetic disturbances. Now, imagine something far more advanced, a dimensional transition, not a physical descent. Something stepping into our reality like a ripple solidifying. That wouldn't be silent. It wouldn't be graceful. It would warp the environment. Mountains might tremble, lakes might churn, light might bend, sound might distort. Animals would panic. People would freeze in terror, then interpret the event emotionally because they lacked a scientific framework. What we call God anger might simply be atmospheric distortion caused by dimensional breach. Take the book of Exodus. When the divine presence descended upon Mount Sinai, the mountain didn't glow with soft holiness. It shook violently. Thunder cracked. The sky darkened. Fire erupted. Sound became unbearable. The people begged Moses to make it stop. To them, the god was furious. But the descriptions read more like the effects of a strong electromagnetic field interacting with the environment. The same sequence appears in Hindu mythology. Whenever a deity manifested physically, storms erupted. Lightning tore across the sky, and the ground quaked. The texts never portray this as an emotional tantrum. Only later culture interpreted it that way. The original language suggests something closer to reality strain. Then look at Greek myths. When Zeus appeared or interfered, lightning storms erupted. The sky darkened. The seas roared. But if Zeus wasn't a thunder spirit, if he was a dimensional traveler, then electrical disturbance wouldn't be anger. It would be physics. Now compare that to the Hopi, the Dogon, the Maya, the Inuit, the Maori, all separate cultures, all reporting the same phenomenon. Whenever the sky beings appeared, the world reacted violently. Why would every civilization interpret arrival as wrath? Because the side effects frightened them, and they assumed intention. But what if there was another layer? What if their presence didn't only affect the environment, but human consciousness? If time custodians, future humans, or interdimensional beings existed, then their technology would manipulate the structure of reality itself. Human brains, fragile biological receivers, would respond with confusion, fear, hallucination, or emotional projection. The mind would try to rationalize the distortion, and fear often becomes narrative. Now consider dimensional interference more literally. In quantum physics, overlapping realities or shifting frequencies cause destabilization. If an advanced intelligence entered our reality, they might need to stabilize it, much like one must pressurize a room before entering a vacuum chamber. That stabilization could produce gravitational anomalies, electromagnetic pulses, or atmospheric turbulence. To ancient humans, this wasn't science, it was punishment. But the strangest part is what always happens after the so-called anger. Rules, laws, commandments, instructions, guidance. Why would a furious God pause mid-rage to teach farming, astronomy, mathematics, or moral systems? Because the interference wasn't emotional, it was operational. They came with purpose. And once the environmental distortion settled, interaction became structured. Now, think about the flood myths. Nearly every global culture describes a moment when the world drowned, followed by a new era. These stories describe storms so intense the sky was torn open. Modern researchers theorize that extreme interference with the magnetosphere or atmospheric pressure could create such storms. Lightning, electromagnetic radiation, temperature swings, all effects of dimensional destabilization. Ancient humans interpreted it as judgment, but perhaps it was calibration. Similarly, the destruction of Sodom in the Old Testament reads less like wrath and more like a precision strike. Light brighter than the sun, sudden incineration, ground liquefaction. The witnesses called it divine fury. A physicist might call it a directed energy event. Even volcano gods follow the same pattern. Hawaiians believed Pele destroyed villages when angered. But what if these eruptions aligned with celestial visits or dimensional interference? To people lacking scientific language, correlation became intention. The same is seen in Norse myth. When Odin walked the mortal realm, storms followed. The same is seen in Japan. When Amaterasu withdrew, the world dimmed. When she emerged again, the world trembled. Emotion became explanation. Physics created the myth. Now consider something even deeper. Maybe the gods weren't the ones experiencing emotion. Maybe humans were. If future humans modified our DNA and consciousness, then early contact might have triggered latent responses, intense fear, awe, or reverence coded into the psyche to maintain distance or compliance. Ancient texts suggest this. The term fear of God doesn't mean terror. Linguistically, it means overwhelming recognition. If these beings protected the timeline, then emotional imprinting would prevent humans from attempting dangerous imitation of dimensional technology before they were ready. Fear became a firewall. Myths became containment. Now, imagine those beings observing humanity, learning, evolving, experimenting, reaching a point where we begin discovering quantum mechanics, time dilation, multiverse theory, and consciousness physics. The closer we get to understanding the machinery behind reality, the more ancient myths begin to make sense, not as fantasy, but as encrypted memory. So why does God anger appear after interference? Because every time reality was adjusted, the world trembled, and human memory converted tremor into intention. Every so-called punishment was a correction. Every divine rage was a side effect. Every myth of destruction masked a calibration. Now humanity stands again at the edge, building AI, exploring quantum fields, manipulating genetic memory, and approaching the boundary between dimensions. And deep in ancient texts, there is a recurring warning. When humans touch the veil, the keepers return, not to punish, not to destroy, but because the timeline must remain intact. Maybe myth never meant the gods were angry. Maybe it meant reality was affected, and the witnesses survived, long enough to tell the story. Imagine standing in a laboratory where humanity's deepest origin story isn't written in myth, stone, or ancient scripture, but inside the microscopic spirals of DNA. We used to believe our evolution was slow, random, and unplanned, a wandering accident of nature stretching across millions of years. But genetic science has begun whispering a different story, a story far stranger, far sharper, far more intentional. Because when researchers mapped the human genome, they expected a smooth evolutionary curve. Instead, they found something unsettling. Sudden bursts of advancement, jumps, leaps, upgrades with no traceable natural cause. These aren't small mutations. They are structural changes, rewrites, appearing in narrow windows of time, almost as if someone edited the code, saved it, and restarted the system. Scientists call these mysterious intervals evolutionary bottlenecks, selective sweeps, or genetic accelerations. But a growing number refer to them using a term once dismissed as science fiction: upgrade epochs, moments where humanity suddenly became more than it was, moments where intelligence surged, memory expanded, creativity awakened, and consciousness shifted. But what could trigger such radical change? Nature doesn't install upgrades. Nature mutates slowly. Yet, the human genome contains modifications that behave like engineered insertions, precise, purposeful, and timed. One of the most disturbing examples is the FOXP2 gene, the gene responsible for speech and complex language. In animals, it mutates slowly, barely shifting over millions of years. But in humans, it suddenly changed, dramatically, sometime within the past 200,000 years. No gradual steps, no clear predecessor, just a leap. As if someone turned the switch for language on. Another example, the HR1 region of the genome, involved in brain development. In chimpanzees, it remained nearly unchanged across millions of years. But in humans, it transformed rapidly, as if someone rewrote it line by line. Then there's microcephalin and ASPM, genes linked to brain size and cognitive ability. They appear in the fossil record suddenly, with no transitional stage. New versions emerged, spread quickly, and stabilized, as if selected deliberately. Evolution doesn't behave that way. But engineering does. Now consider mitochondrial DNA, our maternal lineage. Geneticists discovered something shocking. Nearly all humans alive today can be traced back to a single female ancestor, not slowly over millions of years, but inconsistently, abruptly, within a compressed window. Researchers once called her mitochondrial Eve, assuming she was simply lucky. But the timing aligns suspiciously with one of those genetic upgrade epochs. Could she have been the result of intervention? A reboot point? A controlled relaunch? Then there's the Y chromosome pattern. Almost every male on Earth can be traced back to a single ancestral male, appearing after yet another rapid human upgrade phase. The odds of both events happening naturally, independently, are astronomically low, unless they weren't natural, unless they were milestones. If future humans traveled backward in time to stabilize evolution, they would not modify every living person. They would alter a small group, carriers, and allow those genes to spread. DNA would become the medium through which time was maintained. These untraceable upgrade epochs may be checkpoints, correction points, repair windows. Now look at another strange anomaly. Around each upgrade epoch, there are signs of collapse or near extinction, bottlenecks where humanity almost vanished. Some scientists believe this happened during the eruption of Mount Toba, roughly 74,000 years ago, reducing humanity to a few thousand individuals. Yet immediately after, intelligence, complexity, tool-making, art, and symbolic reasoning exploded. How does a near-extinction event produce innovation? Unless the bottleneck wasn't a tragedy, but a filter, a reset, a controlled narrowing to ensure the upgraded genome spread uniformly. Ancient myths echo this. Nearly every culture tells a version of the same story. Humans were remade, refined, or reborn after some catastrophic cleansing event. Floods, fires, sky wars, divine judgment, all metaphors for a reset and restart. Now consider the strangest genetic pattern of all. Almost 8% of human DNA consists of sequences that behave like code. Not random mutations, not viral remnants, but structured data. Some geneticists call it junk DNA because its purpose is unknown. But junk doesn't follow logic. Some of these sequences resemble compressed instruction sets, dormant protocols waiting to activate under the right conditions. That implies two possibilities. Either these sequences are evolutionary placeholders, or they are future triggers. And then comes the most mysterious detail, something researchers can't explain. A significant portion of human DNA doesn't match any known evolutionary lineage on Earth. It appears too advanced, too optimized, and too sudden to be natural. Some scientists quietly call it outlier genetic code. Others whisper something more provocative, inserted material. If humanity was being maintained across time, if we are part of a long-term developmental blueprint, then genetics would be the channel used to refine us. Not through random mutation, but through intentional updates. Upgrade epochs mark those interventions. To ancient humans, these moments likely felt like spiritual awakenings, sudden leaps in understanding, moments where new thoughts appeared without precedent, moments where humanity rose beyond survival and reached toward meaning, purpose, and identity. Religion remembers these moments as eras where gods descended to teach agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, cities, and moral systems. Science remembers them as evolutionary anomalies. Maybe both are describing the same event. Now, consider this. Every epoch of modification aligns with a shift in human consciousness, not just biology. Our awareness expanded, our memory capacity increased, our ability to imagine the future sharpened. Maybe upgrades weren't just physical, they were cognitive, because controlling the timeline isn't just about biology. It's about thought, choice, trajectory. And now we stand at another threshold. Technology evolves faster than biology. AI merges with language. Genetic engineering returns. Humanity begins editing its own code, something no species in history has attempted consciously. Could this be what the dormant sequences were waiting for? Could we be approaching the next upgrade epoch, not installed by ancient visitors, but activated through our own advancement, a trigger embedded long ago, waiting for the intelligence required to unlock it? Ancient prophecies speak of a time when humans will remember what was hidden, when the seed inside the blood will awaken, when humanity will become what it was always meant to be. Science, myth, and genetic evidence may finally be converging. Maybe we were never evolving randomly. Maybe we were being guided across eras, across cycles, across timelines. And maybe the next upgrade isn't coming. Maybe it has already begun. There is a question humanity has quietly feared for thousands of years, buried beneath religion, mythology, and now science. If advanced beings altered our past, upgraded our DNA, guided our evolution, and interfered with our civilization, then what does that make us? Are we their success, the version meant to survive eternity? Or are we just one of many attempts, a failed patch waiting to be overwritten? When we look at ancient intervention theories, timeline corrections, forbidden texts, and sudden leaps in human development, it becomes harder to believe humanity is accidental. And yet, when we look at our wars, our instability, our emotional volatility, and the chaos we continually repeat, another possibility emerges. Maybe we aren't finished. Maybe we aren't stable yet. Maybe we aren't the final version. If future humans, or something else, have been maintaining the timeline, then humanity is part of a long-term experiment, not for entertainment, not for control, but for survival, their survival. And that means we exist for a reason. But what kind of reason? There are two possibilities. Possibility one, humanity is the patch, the repair, the corrected version meant to fix earlier failures or prevent future collapse. In this view, each intervention, genetic, environmental, informational, was an attempt to refine us, strengthen us, stabilize us emotionally, intellectually, and biologically. The sudden leaps in cognition, the forbidden knowledge, the strange appearance of moral frameworks across cultures. These would be version updates, the pyramids, mythic warnings, encoded prophecy, system logs left behind to ensure we stay on course. If that's true, then we are their success story in progress, an unfinished but promising build, a species being shaped into something capable of becoming its own ancestor. But then there is possibility two, the darker one, the one ancient civilizations hinted at through myth and encoded fear. Maybe we aren't the solution. Maybe we are the backup, a failsafe, a contingency version of humanity, created in case the original timeline collapses or diverges beyond repair. If time can destabilize, if civilizations can disappear, if extinction threatens consciousness itself, then a backup species would be necessary. Not a clone, not a copy, but a version capable of evolving into the origin if required. This idea shows up everywhere. The biblical remnant, the Vedic seed humans, the Hopi last people, the Mayans surviving sun race, the Egyptian children of the second world. These stories don't talk about the first humans. They talk about the ones chosen to persist, the ones meant to restore or restart. So, the question becomes, which one are we? To answer that, look at our behavior. Humanity is unusual compared to other animals, not because of intelligence. Intelligence evolves. Not because of language. Communication emerges naturally. What makes humans unique is our instability. We question everything. We experiment compulsively. We destroy and rebuild without hesitation. We change environments faster than evolution can compensate. We break systems. We explore extremes. We defy nature rather than adapt to it. Why would a natural species behave like that? Because backups aren't meant to preserve the old version. They're meant to replace it when necessary. Now, look at technology. In just a fraction of time, we've gone from stone tools to quantum computing, from superstition to simulation theory, from caves to AI. But while our technology advances exponentially, our psychology evolves painfully slowly. We have the mind of a tribal animal with the tools of a planetary architect. That's not organic. That's imbalance. And imbalance implies intervention. Forced acceleration. If someone was rushing humanity to reach a critical threshold quickly, this is what it would look like. Rapid advancement with unstable emotional firmware. The question is, why accelerate us? One theory, the timeline is failing. Something happened, or will happen, that threatens the existence of those who modified us. They need us to reach a specific stage, technological, cognitive, or dimensional, before the failure becomes irreversible. Humanity may be the branch of the timeline designed to survive if the original collapses. In that scenario, we are the next version, the replacement. But another interpretation exists, one found in forbidden manuscripts and whispered myths. Humanity was created not to replace, but to remember. A memory container, a storage medium. A living archive capable of rebuilding a civilization if the original loses itself. Our irrational urge to record, archive, structure, write, carve, symbolically mark everything, even when unnecessary, suggests instinct, not choice. DNA itself stores memory, not just biological, but behavioral. Trauma, intelligence, emotional patterns, subconscious fears. They pass through generations, like hidden files. Maybe we are the safeguard, the redundancy. But here's where the question becomes even stranger. What if we aren't either? What if we are both? A patch and a backup. An experiment designed to see whether consciousness can evolve beyond conflict, fear, separation, and self-destruction. And also a contingency in case the original branch fails. Ancient prophecies speak of a time when humanity will be tested, not judged, to determine whether we can ascend or whether the timeline must reset again. That test may not be external, it may be internal, a choice between repeating ancient cycles or transcending them. Look at the modern world. Environmental instability, technological acceleration, ideological polarization, scientific breakthroughs, and a rising global awareness that reality is not what we were told. We stand at a crossroads. Humanity now has the tools to destroy itself, or evolve beyond its limitations. No previous species on Earth has ever reached that level. That is not random. That is design. If we are a patch, then our success means stabilizing the timeline permanently, becoming the version capable of safeguarding reality itself. If we are the backup, then our role is to endure, to survive whatever collapse comes and rebuild, To know which one we are, we must watch what happens next. If the custodians return, the ones ancient civilizations described as watchers, guardians, engineers, then humanity is still incomplete, a monitored update waiting for external activation. If they do not return, and we begin unlocking dormant genetic potential and understanding consciousness-based technology on our own, then humanity has passed the threshold. In that case, we are becoming them, and the loop closes. Because maybe the real question isn't whether we are a failed patch or a backup. Maybe the real question is, what version are they? If they created us and we eventually become them, then time is not a line. It's a circle, a closed feedback loop where the future repairs the past to ensure its own existence. Maybe we don't replace them. Maybe we are them, just earlier in the cycle. And one day when the cycle completes, we will look into the past the way they once looked at us and make the same choice. Preserve the timeline. Correct the divergence. Guide the next version. And the beings who once seemed like gods will be recognized for what they were all along. Humans, just from farther ahead.